Okay, so today we're going to look at life chances. So what we looked at last lesson, we looked at achieved and ascribed status. So what the difference is between achieved and ascribed status, something that you're born with, or something that you work towards in your lifetime, like something that you earn, for example. Now, in terms of the wider topic that we're looking at is on social stratification. How are people in society divided? And there are different reasons why these kind of outcomes happen. So one of these is life chances. So we're going to talk about what these life chances are, what they mean, some examples of what these life chances are as well. So examples of these kind of life chances that I mean are good health. So people having good health, employment, education, housing, social mobility. And what we mean by social mobility is, if you're born poor, for example, can you have a chance to actually get wealthier and be more successful? And can your children have a better life than you did, for example? So this is mobility. People can move up the scale. Remember, we looked at before, if we're talking about social mobility, we looked at a couple of examples. Remember, we looked at the estate system. Yeah, so there wasn't a great deal of social mobility. If you're born poor in the estate system in feudal Europe, it was very hard to move up the list. If you were born a slave, again, it would be very difficult to have any social mobility to improve your standing. So these were forms where that didn't really happen. But what we're looking at here, again, are life chances. So have people's life chances got better, yeah, or have they got worse in some situations? Um, so this is affected by the nature of stratification, a particular society, norms, values, or laws. So what might happen is that there might be specific laws that prevent people from improving their life chances. So a good example, well, not good, but an example of this is in South Africa. So there was a system called apartheid, and this was where basically, if you were black or Indian, if you were not what they considered white skinned, you were very heavily limited in what you could do. You couldn't go to certain restaurants. You would have to use different toilets. You weren't allowed to stay in certain places like hotels, for example. And there was a very clear divide, which had a knock-on effect on many Black South Africans in society. It gave them less of an opportunity to be successful. And the same thing was in the United States, is particularly in the south of the southern states of America, where it was a very almost a very similar system of apartheid there, where again people were not allowed, if they were African American, to access certain services or facilities. And there was a huge protest against this, which eventually led to laws being changed in both countries. Um, but the key thing to note here is that if you were born into a system like this, you can imagine how difficult it would be to escape this, to make a better life for yourself, for your children. If you were limited in the kind of jobs that you could get, in the kind of salaries that you could get, in your day-to-day movements and who you would have to associate with, where you could live. So again, in both countries, there were certain areas where you would not even be allowed to live, or you would face a lot of hostility if you were to live in those areas. So there was a lot of segregation, people living in their own communities, not mixing, and there being very strict rules on movement of people. So when I was in South Africa, I went to Johannesburg. There was a District 6 museum where there was a gentleman who was speaking about his time in South Africa, under apartheid. He was um, of Pakistani origin, a Pakistani Muslim man, and he was talking about with his family when his son was younger. There was a situation where he was trying to catch a train. He was on a train platform waiting for the train, and he was with his son. And there's separate areas for non-whites in South Africa, and his son was really needed to use a toilet, but there was the only toilet that was open was the one that was for whites only. It says on the door, because the other toilet was locked, it wasn't working. So he basically had this situation where he said, what do I do? Do I basically let my son make a mess here on the platform? Do I let him actually go to the toilet where he's not allowed to? And if I do let him do that, if someone catches me, he could get beaten by the police, he could get arrested. And that's when it really dawned on him, sort of the ludicrousness of a situation like this, and how could it actually be against the law for something like that. And just that was just one of many things that he told us, about how life was like, back then for a lot of South Africans. But that gives you kind of insight into how it would be. So key term that you might need to know here are human rights and civil rights, the kind of difference between those. So one question we say is this a human right? That's like we should all be treated equally. We shouldn't be discriminated against by the color of our skin. Now, everyone would generally agree with that, or most people would agree with that today. But in practice, in South Africa and in America, these were quite obvious things. But now maybe this kind of prejudice is more subtle. It's harder to notice, but it might still be there. And other things, not just race, other things that could factor into people's life chances are that some social groups might have a pessimistic attitude towards life. So they may have very little control over what happens to them. So this is called fatalism. Some people might think, well, I'm never going to get here. I'm never going to get into this position in society. What's the point? So they kind of almost give up on this dream. And so this kind of fatalism might affect someone in this family that maybe they want to achieve something, but the rest of the family, let's say, don't see it as something important. Maybe they want to go to university, but the rest of the family haven't gone to university, but they don't see it as something that's particularly important, and they see it maybe as a waste of time and a waste of money. So examples here, you might notice the Marxists might say working class fatalism comes from a false consciousness. So workers have been socialized into accepting that capitalist society is fair, that their own position is their own fault, and those who have power and wealth deserve their position. So this is also this is a fascinating insight into like why this kind of behavior might happen, and why certain people might vote for political parties that seem to contradict or seem not to be in their interests. So some people might argue, Marxists might argue, that maybe some people have been brainwashed into thinking that the kind of society they have is fair. So if someone is poor, they deserve to be poor. They haven't worked hard enough to make a good life for themselves. And the people who've got all the money, they deserved it. Maybe they got a lucky break. Maybe they worked really hard to get there. Maybe they were smarter than these people. I don't know. Would you agree with something like that? In my opinion, I think that's a very simplistic view. So this is what the Marxists are saying, that this is a simplistic view, and that actually, the working class, again, believe this simple view of capitalist society, and basically are fatalistic about it. They say, it's our fate. This is what happens. What can we do about it? Yeah. But what happens when you have a fatalistic outlook like this? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you don't think you can improve something, then it's very unlikely that you will do that. Yeah. So remember, we looked at this in psychology. You can relate this to the growth mindset theory. Yeah. That, if you're not encouraged or praised to do something, and if you basically, give up on the thought of doing that, then it'll be very easy to not do that. Yeah. So that's a very powerful effect that you have there. So what you might see is that how groups are stratified is by something called gratification. Now, there are two types of gratification. You have planning for the long term. So, for example, saving money.
Yeah,
You
it's
have,
very scary.
you have practice of deferred
Say
gratification
when
as
they
well.
finish it, there will be recession.
Okay, guys, if you haven't got a mic on, can I just ask you to switch it off?
Yeah, everything is gonna stop.
Okay, so deferred gratification is something that, let's say, you will delay. Yeah, instant gratification is something that you want now. Let's give an example. So if you wanted to go to university, okay, so you basically you make the choice. Yeah, if you finish your GCSEs, your A levels, and you go to university, you know that you're not going to have as much money over the next 3 years when you're studying. So why would you even go to university? The idea is that it's deferred gratification. So those 3 years that you don't earn as much, you're going to have a better standard of living when you're more qualified, because if you have a degree, that's going to lead you to get better jobs. Now, this hasn't always worked out for everyone. I know, for example, my sister, she's a graphic designer. Now, a lot of people on her course ended up doing jobs that they could have done before university, working in restaurants, working in retail. They didn't need a degree for those kind of jobs. So it doesn't necessarily always work that way, but usually, that is the plan. So I had a friend who is now a managing partner at a law firm. So he's a lawyer, a solicitor, and at the time, I mean, I feel a little bit bad. I kind of laughed at him because he was working for free for a year. So he did his degree. He did 3 years of a degree. Then he did his postgraduate law degree. Then he worked for a company where he was basically volunteering for a year. So he didn't get any salary, but was working really hard there for that 1 year. But what happened was, the company recognized that he was doing that, and he got all his hours he needed for to become a lawyer, and has worked his way up now to become a partner at this, basically one of the owners of this law firm. So if they make any profits, he gets a share of the profits as well. So he's done very well from that. But this is a perfect example of deferred gratification. So it might be attractive to, let's say leave school at 18, get a full-time job, and earn, earn a salary. But at some point, you might find it hard to get promoted, or might find it hard to get ahead in your career unless you have these qualifications. So yeah, the flip side is this immediate gratification. So if there's a sudden change in fortune, maybe you inherited some money, you won a lottery, you would spend this wealth straight away rather than investing it to ensure long-term affluence, to be richer in the future. Now, it's been suggested, I think, I don't know specifically, but this is kind of a cliche stereotype argument, that the working class are more likely to practice immediate gratification. Why might that be? Because their standard of living is lower, so an immediate improvement is highly desirable. So basically, to simplify this, one argument people might make is that if you're poor, you might actually save less money or not see it as so important. You might actually spend it on something enjoyable, because if your kind of circumstances are basically hard day to day, day after day, you might actually want to just enjoy something and actually be a little lavish in your spending. This is one argument. I don't think this necessarily stacks up for many people that I see, but it's one potential argument. People also say things like, the rich stay rich by being very careful with their money, for example. So this could be a different kind of attitude towards that. So they look for the here and now rather than years in the future. But I don't know if that's something you would agree with. From what I've seen, I see many people, working class people, who want their children to have better life chances than they do. So they will invest that time and effort into their children's future, for example. But you need to know the difference here between deferred and immediate gratification. Deferred gratification, being able to set long-term goals and planning for the future, and immediate gratification, choosing instant satisfaction rather than waiting for a greater reward in the future. I will link this back to something I probably mentioned to you in psychology before about the marshmallow test. If you don't remember, I'll explain again. There was a test that was done where they gave children a choice between two marshmallows. If they can have one marshmallow now, or they can have two marshmallows later if they don't eat the marshmallow that's on the table. So the experimenter would say that they would leave the room, they would leave the child there with one marshmallow on the table. Now, young children found it very hard to wait for the second marshmallow. You know, they wanted that one marshmallow. You know, lots of children would end up just eating the one marshmallow. What kind of gratification would that be if they ate the marshmallow and they didn't wait for a second one? This would be immediate gratification. The children who had deferred gratification, the ones who could wait for a second marshmallow, they looked at studies of how they did later in life. The children who could wait for a second marshmallow, they lived longer, they had less risk of terminal illness, such as cancer, they were less likely to get divorced, they earned more money, they were more successful in their career, and you know, across a number of different things, they generally were doing better at life. They were winning at life. So this is quite interesting, and this links into what we're saying here, that actually, if you're able to have this deferred gratification, that might be a suggestion you could be more successful in your life, and that may link to, you know, what some sociologists have talked about class. There are other examples of life chances, though, not just class. You have life expectancy, so how long someone is expected to live. Historically, life expectancy was low because lots of infants and children died. What's interesting is when you look at life expectancy, you know, people generally not just live longer now, but what is meant here is that on average people live longer because the infant mortality rate is lower now. So more babies and children survive childhood than they did a long time ago, because back then, if people got an infection that today you could cure very easily by a visit to the hospital or even just with some medication, back then it would have been fatal. It would have been a death sentence for people. So actually, if you survived into adulthood, generally people lived just as long. You know, some people did live into old age, but this was the reason why. So if you can look at these graphs here, so have a look at these graphs and what they show you. So what do the colors mean here? You might notice something, for example, the child mortality rate. So can you see that blue line has gone down, yeah, over the years? So starting from 1970 going all the way to 2010, child mortality rate per 1,000 births has dropped dramatically across the world. And what happens is, as a country gets richer by their GDP, so let's say we call it a country richer, the child mortality rate goes down. Yeah. So this is a very interesting statistic that you can see here. There are other differences between groups as well in life chances. So if we compare gender, women live longer. And if this is just down to life expectancy. On average, women tend to live longer than men. On average, about 5 years. But why might this be? Men might be more likely to be in high-risk situations, so a higher risk of accidental death. They're more likely to be in car accidents. They're more likely to be working in jobs like mining or factory, dangerous kind of work. You know, that's riskier. Also, men in many societies consume more alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs as well. So this makes more.
I don't want to go to people.
Guys, can you switch off your mic, please?
So much work and
So, yeah, men in many societies consume alcohol, tobacco, and drugs more than women. Yeah, so at risk of overdose or serious diseases as well. There's other biological reasons why men and women, have shorter life expectancies. The other thing I could add to this as well is the suicide rate for men is much higher than women as well. Yeah, so this is also could be a potential effect of gender here. So we talked a little bit about social class. We talked about this idea about the working class and why, let's say, the working class might not defer gratification. Again, like it's a very controversial theory, but that's one theory that was posited before. Now, working class people in general have lower life expectancy than the middle classes in the same society. So, if you take the UK as an example, when we talk about class, let me just clarify again. Now we talk, let's say, working class, middle class, upper class. We generally define this by the jobs that people do. So jobs like cleaning or labor work would be considered working class occupations. I don't like this word routine occupations. Obviously, you're all following what's happening with the coronavirus right now. And if you're following in countries like the UK, it's people in these kind of jobs, people working in supermarkets, people again working as cleaners in hospitals and in the streets and doing rubbish collection. These are all jobs that are lower paid. People would call them unskilled, but without these jobs, the society would not be able to survive right now. So actually, people are rethinking these kind of jobs. But anyway, people who did these kind of jobs like cleaners or laborers, their life expectancy was 5 years less, 74 and a half years. Whereas people who were managers or professionals, their life expectancy was much longer, 5 years longer. So why do you think people who did jobs like cleaning and laboring essentially died earlier than people who were office workers? What kind of reason
Maybe
could
because
there
there's
be?
like more stress on them and they have to, it's different to like office work. It's like more to do it. It can damage their bodies in some ways. Like, that makes
Okay,
sense.
yeah, so the physical impact of the kind of work they're doing. Yeah, that could be one reason. Any other reasons you think? Do you think they would retire at the same age?
No, I don't think so.
So who do you think would work until they're older?
I think the cleaners would have to work whatever age and then the office people would retire.
Yeah. So maybe, if you're earning a higher salary, you might be able to retire earlier. You might be able to work shorter hours, before you get to that point. Whereas if you're not earning as much, you might be forced to work, much longer. You might have to work if you have health problems already, you might have to keep working even though you've got those health problems. So, that's going to affect you as well. They're making changes in the UK that, the retirement age is going to go up. And so it could even change further. But like, let's say you're a teacher in England, you're going to have to work if you're a male teacher until you're 68 and it might be 70. I mean, like, I get tired enough now doing a full day's teaching. I'm kind of scared at the thought of having to, teach a class when I'm like 68 years old. That's going to be a lot of work. So hopefully I'll be able to retire by then. But some people, they don't have that option. They have to work. Some people have had to come out of retirement in their 70s and work because they can't afford to live on a pension, for example, because the job they were doing before, wasn't paying enough for them. So this might be, these might be some reasons why class has a big impact. And if you notice, the royal family, You know, the Queen Mother lived to a very long age. The Queen, you know, again, is living to old age, again, because they have access. The other thing is maybe they have access to private healthcare, for example, you know, and better nutrition. So they'll be, let's say, eating better, taking, you know, care of themselves in that way that poorer people are not able to do. So again, if you have a look at this bar chart here, so what you might notice, you have a median age of death. So this is kind of like a midpoint. At what age? I know this is a nice and cheerful chart here. You know, what age do people die? You know, on average, you know, what's the kind of midpoint there? And it's around this kind of time. So what do you notice from? So the blue bar graph is showing what, and what's the orange bar graph showing? So the blue is showing from 1982 to 1986. So from, you know, 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, and orange from fairly recent times, 2007 to 2011. And what you tend to see is actually, you know, the life expectancy has gone up for both. Okay, so on this side of the graph, you can see for, let's say, office workers, professional jobs, and here for something called routine occupations. What I was saying, you know, cleaning, laboring work. Now, but if you compare, what's the difference here? You can see the median age here is 83.6. This was, yeah, and the modal age 85.7. So actually, this, you know, again, has, there is a difference here. Even though it's gone up for both groups, still this happens. In 2007 to 2011, the age at death is lower for people doing routine occupations. Another aspect of life chances that can be affected is ethnicity. So if you belong to particular ethnic groups, are you lower down the socioeconomic scale? So some people might argue, depending on where you're from, you might be disadvantaged in society. Now, but there are some certain things like health conditions. So one example is Afro-Caribbean population in England, in the UK, has a higher rate of sickle cell anemia than the average population. I think within Asian communities, diabetes is quite prevalent, higher than, you know, than average. So health problems might be specific to people from a certain region of the world. It might be something that's actually genetic, but there are also other factors in society. You know, do some people feel racially discriminated against? You know, in particular. So if we look at this pie chart in, you know, in more detail, this is, you know, how the UK would be, let's say, classified. You know, according to different ethnic groups. It might be hard to see all of the different groups there, but essentially, let's say, you know, 6-7% of the population you would consider as an ethnic minority in the UK. But that's not including people from Ireland or Wales, who would also consider themselves as distinctly, you know, different to, say, white British. Okay, so in a nutshell, those are a few factors to do with it. But actually, no, I'll just go back before I finish up. Something else on ethnicity, I'd say. What's interesting at the moment, with the leading party in the UK, the Conservative Party. Now, there are actually quite a few very important people in this political party who are British Asian, British Indian descent. And what you see in the last maybe 10 years, 15 years, there are a lot more people from British Asian backgrounds who've, let's say, entered politics. But particularly in the Conservative Party. Now, the Conservative Party is an aspirational party, which has generally traditionally been associated with, you know, with rich white Britons, not necessarily all the people voting for them are, but it seemed to, represent their interests more than anyone else. So what's interesting is how traditionally people from the British Asian community tended to be Labour voters. They were aligned to a different political party. But you're seeing more and more people from British Asian background voting for the Conservative Party, joining the Conservative Party as ministers. So the finance minister for the UK, which is a very, very important job. And, right now, all eyes are on this person, Rishi Sunak, is from this background. He's a son of immigrants, of British Asian immigrants, and has aspired and done very well to get to that point. So maybe there are certain ethnic groups who do disproportionately well in certain jobs than the average population. That's a big topic that I can't, I'm not going to be able to go into in this session, but it's something interesting to, have a discussion about, with your parents as well. Do you think some groups of people have tended to be more successful in society? Why do you think that might be? What kind of things have they kind of taken advantage of? What kind of disadvantages do other groups tend to have? So it's not as simple as just saying if you're from different ethnic background, you're going to be disadvantaged. Maybe the disadvantage is manifested in different ways. Okay. So finally, I'm going to wrap up here. Your questions for next week. So there are 3 questions actually I want you to work on. First, what do you think the main factors are affecting life chances in society today? Yeah. So send me this as an email response. I'd love to hear your opinion on this. Actually, what you could do is after I finish this, just type into the chat box, what you think the main factors affecting life chances in society are today. What do you think are the most important things affecting life chances? Are there things that I haven't mentioned, for example, that you think are affecting life chances in society?
Sir, I don't really understand that. What do you mean? What do you think? Like, what affects our life?
Life chances. So how well you do in your life. So what is it basically?
Oh,
But the things that we've talked through here, is it to do with the family you're born into? Is it to do with your race? Is it to do with your gender? Are there other
yeah.
things that might affect how well you do in your life? So are there some things that could block you from doing well or not? Yeah. So that's what I mean by life chances. Okay. And then the other 2 questions that I want you to look at is, again, define this difference between immediate and deferred gratification. So what is the difference between immediate and deferred gratification? Try to give an example in your answer as well, just so it's clear for you, for your revision. And then the last question, some reasons why working class people tend to die younger than middle class people on average. Yeah. So again, going back from the notes, from what I've said, from the presentation, and from your textbook, try to give a more detailed response for that. Okay. But also really think about this discussion question. And I want your personal take. There's no right or wrong answer for this, but try to use the evidence that we've used here. Okay, so have a think about that now, and you've got till next week's lesson, to finish all these off. So tomorrow morning, I'll go through this with you. Ask me any questions you like. If you are awake and available, it would be great actually if we could have a discussion about this all together. So whoever is actually there, we can actually have some kind of debate about this. Okay, right. So I will leave it there. But I'm available if you need any questions. If you want to ask me any questions.
Okay.